All right, everyone, welcome back. In the last lecture, we talked about structural, economic, and political drivers of conflict. We looked at how conflict vulnerability is shaped by things like institutions, governance, state fragility, political exclusion, economic inequality, resource competition, and kind of those broader structural pressures. One of the main takeaways from that lecture is, as always, that conflict rarely emerges from one single condition. A society may experience poverty without violence, they may experience political tension without civil war, or inequality without immediate instability. So in this lecture, we're going to build on that by asking a slightly different question, which is, why do some tensions escalate? Why do some grievances become organized into things like rebellion, insurgency, political violence, or civil conflict? Why do some conflicts remain contained while others become prolonged, violent, and extremely difficult to resolve? So this lecture is about, again, kind of these multi-causal conflict and conflict onset models. So in other words, we're asking, how do different causes combine? How do grievances, incentives, opportunities, institutions, and strategic decisions interact? And why are conflict systems so difficult to predict? The central message today is, once again, that conflicts are rarely linear, they're rarely simple, and they're rarely reducible to one cause. They usually emerge through these layered and interacting processes. So this idea connects directly to this week's concept reflection, where you're asked to explain why conflicts are rarely caused by one single factor. So as we go through today's lecture, I want you to keep asking things like, what factors are interacting here? What does each theory help us see? And what might these theories miss? So we're going to reiterate, because this is kind of the central theme of the course at this point, the problem of single cause or monocausal explanations. A monocausal explanation is one that reduces conflict to a single main cause. So people might say, this conflict is about poverty. This conflict is about religion. This conflict is about ancient hatreds or ethnicity. This conflict is just because of one bad leader. This conflict happened because people were irrational. Or this happened because one group is just inherently or simply violent. Those explanations may sometimes contain a small piece of the truth. Economic hardship does matter. Religion might matter. Leadership matters. Historical memory matters. But the problem is that they become misleading when they're treated as the entire explanation. So, for example, if we say this conflict is about poverty, that doesn't experience why many societies that don't experience poverty don't experience civil war, or vice versa, why many poor societies don't experience civil war. If we say it's about religion, it doesn't explain how religious diversity exists peacefully in some places, and sometimes it becomes politicized. If we say it's about things like ancient hatred, we ignore modern political institutions, economic incentives, elite mobilization, colonial histories, state violence, and the strategic decisions that happen along the way. So again, we're moving beyond single cause explanations. We're asking how these different factors interact. A civil conflict might be about things like long-standing political exclusion, but also unequal access to resources, also weak institutions, also economic insecurity, state repression, leadership decisions, group grievances, armed group recruitment, and then maybe a triggering event. So none of those factors might sufficiently explain the conflict on their own, but together they create conditions where conflict becomes more likely. So this is, again, why these multi-causal analysis are so important. Different theories help us explain different pieces of conflict systems. This connects to the idea in the assignment this week is, looking at the different dimensions to not find the cause. So when you're listening, you're going to ask yourself things like, what different pressures are interacting here? What conditions reinforce one another? And why might different people interpret this same conflict different ways? And one of the central skills in this is learning to think relationally rather than simplistically. So some theories help us understand incentives. Some help us understand grievances. Some help us understand strategic behavior. Some help us understand institutions. Some help us understand complexity and unpredictability. And the goal, again, is not to choose one theory and reject all the others. What I want you to do is collect all those theories and try and understand which theory reveals what and what it leaves out. So let's go back to the greed-grievance debate. Now, this is usually applied in Civil War contexts, and again, largely emerges from Civil War studies, conflict economies, and rational choice approaches. It tries to explain why rebellions emerge and why individuals might choose to participate in them. At the center of it is the debate that, do people mobilize for violence because of genuine grievances or because conflict creates opportunities for private gain? So let's start with grievances. A grievance-based explanation argues that conflict emerges because people experience things like injustice, exclusion, repression, marginalization, inequality, discrimination, or political domination. All of those structural things that we were talking about. And from this perspective, rebellion or violent mobilization might be understood as a response to perceived injustice. So a group may feel that it's been excluded from political power, or a region might feel like it's been systemically neglected by the central government, or a minority group might experience repression, discrimination, or the denial of rights. In these cases, conflict isn't just coming from anger. It's coming from anger, injustice, and demands for change. Now, greed-based explanations focus on different aspects. They ask whether conflict is shaped by things like profit, resources, looting, economic opportunity, war economies, or strategic gain. From this perspective, conflict might become attractive to some actors because it creates opportunities to access things like power, money, resources, or status. So armed groups might finance themselves through things like diamonds, oil, timber, smuggling, taxation of local populations, kidnapping, or control over territory. Now, this doesn't mean that every participant is motivated by greed. That is, again, too simplistic, and we're moving away from simplistic explanations. But it does mean that conflict can create economic opportunities for some actors. And once those opportunities exist, some groups may have incentives to continue the conflict rather than resolve it. So this is one of the most important insights from the greed versus grievance debate. Conflicts can begin for one set of reasons and evolve over time. A movement might start with justice-seeking goals. It might start because people feel excluded, repressed, or marginalized. But over time, if these armed groups or groups gain access to things like money, resources, weapons, territory, the conflict can also become shaped by things like gain, even survival or power. So the motivations can shift. A justice-seeking movement can become resource-seeking. A grievance-based rebellion can really easily become tied to war economies. A political conflict can become profitable for some people, and that makes conflict harder to resolve. Now, one of the most useful ways to look at this debate is not to ask, is this conflict caused by greed or grievance, but how do grievances and incentives interact? Because a lot of times real world conflicts involve both. People may genuinely feel injustice, and leaders may effectively mobilize those grievances. But armed groups also may offer economic incentives, and external actors might provide resources. Weak institutions might fail to manage the conflict, and the conflict itself might create new interests that didn't exist at the beginning. So greed versus grievance is useful because it helps us see that conflict is not only about ideas or emotions, but it's also about opportunity structures, resources, and incentives. So that's why I like to look at it as greed and grievance. But as with all of the approaches, it has some limitations. Critics often argue that greed-based explanations can reduce conflict too heavily to economics. So, like with other approaches, they're overlooking things that matter, like identity, trauma, ideology, emotion, historical memory, dignity, and lived experiences of injustice. On the other hand, purely grievance-based explanations can also be incomplete if they don't look at things like recruitment incentives, armed group financing, opportunity costs, strategic leadership, and the economic benefits that some actors can gain from instability. So the value of this debate isn't that it gives us the final answer. It's that it gives us a way to ask better questions about motivation, opportunity, incentive, and conflict dynamics. That brings us to rational choice theory. Rational choice theory has primarily come from economics, political science, international relations, game theory, and decision theory. At its simplest, it argues that actors make decisions based on their goals, their preferences, their constraints, and their expected outcomes. Now, this is where we need to be careful. When scholars say the word rational, they don't necessarily mean that people are morally right, emotionally calm, perfectly informed, objectively reasonable, or rational. It doesn't mean that people always make good decisions. It means that people often make decisions and choices strategically based on what they think will help them achieve their goals. So in conflict analysis, with rational choice theory, we're asking questions like, what does this actor want? What are the costs of the action? What are the possible benefits? What risks are they willing to accept? What options are available? And how do they expect others to respond? So this can be useful in understanding a lot of different forms of conflict. For an example, an armed group might decide whether to attack, negotiate, recruit, or withdraw based on its assessment of those risks and opportunities. A state might decide whether to repress a protest or negotiate with opposition groups or offer reforms based on those things. A political faction might decide whether to cooperate, defect, escalate, or compromise based on those things. So it does understand decision making. It's especially useful when we talk about strategic interaction. So strategic interaction means that actors don't make decisions in isolation. They make decisions while anticipating what other people might do. So things like reactions, retaliation, cooperation, escalation, and compromise. And this is going to bring us into what's called game theory. So game theory explains situations where the outcome of one actor's decision depends partly on the decisions of the other. And this is super common in conflict. So one example is called the prisoner's dilemma. You may have seen this before, but in the prisoner's dilemma, two actors might both benefit from cooperation, but each fears that the other might defect. So even if cooperation would produce the best overall outcome, mistrust can push both sides towards defensive or self-protective measures. And this matters in conflict because a lot of these situations involve a large degree of uncertainty and mistrust. The groups involved might not trust the promises of their opponents. States may not trust ceasefires. Armed groups may fear things like disarmament. Communities may fear that compromise leaves them vulnerable. So this leads us to another important concept, which is the security dilemma. The security dilemma is a situation where one group takes steps to make itself feel safer, but the other group interprets those steps as threatening. So let's think one group may arm itself because it's fearful of attack, but another group sees that arming themselves as preparation for aggression. So the second group arms itself too. Now the first group is like, okay, I'm even more threatened. And both groups may entirely believe that they're acting defensively, but each side's defensive measures appear offensive to the other. And this can create an escalation spiral. So the security dilemma is often used in international relations to explain arms races between states. But it can also help us understand things like intrastate and intergroup conflict. So, for example, if a society is experiencing ethnic tension, one community may form a self-defense group based on the fact that it feels vulnerable. But another community might interpret that as a sign of aggression. The state might respond with repression, and then armed actors start to mobilize. Then rumors spread, and suddenly actions that each group sees as defensive can suddenly contribute to escalation. This is one of the strengths of rational choice and strategic interaction models. They help us see how conflict can escalate even when actors don't necessarily want violence or full-scale conflict. But mistrust, uncertainty, and fear can produce strategic decisions that, although seem rational, may worsen the conflict. But as always, we're going to go over the limitations. So critics argue that rational choice theories overestimate rationality. They underestimate emotion, they overlook identity, they ignore trauma, they simplify culture, and they assume that actors actually have a better idea or a clearer idea of their preferences than they actually do. In real conflicts, people might not act according to cost-benefit calculations. They are often acting from things like fear, anger, loyalty, humiliation, ideology, moral conviction, revenge, or even identity. So rational choice theory is useful, but again, not complete. It helps us understand things like strategy, incentives, and interaction, but it needs to be combined with other approaches to help us understand conflict in its full. Another useful model for thinking about layered conflict is the distinction between positions, interests, and needs. Now, I think we've touched on this already, but this model is often used in conflict resolution and negotiation, but it also helps us understand why conflicts are rarely about only what appears on the surface. So a position is what a party says it wants. It's the visible demand. So, for example, we want independence. We want this territory. We want this leader removed. We refuse to negotiate. We want control over the institution. Positions are important, but they're only the surface level, usually, of a conflict. Beneath positions are interests. So interests are the reasons behind the position, what they're looking for. So security, political influence, economic access, autonomy, recognition, protection, legitimacy, or even control over resources. So, for example, a group demands territorial autonomy. So the position is, we want autonomy. But the interests beneath that might be things like protection from repression, control over local resources, cultural preservation, political recognition, or a fear of domination by the state. Then beneath those interests are needs. I'm hoping we get to talk a little bit more about needs later in the course because that's one of my favorite groups of approaches. But needs are essentially the deeper foundational requirements. So these are things like safety, dignity, survival, belonging, identity, autonomy, recognition, and basic human security, things like food, water, shelter. So this is why conflict can become so difficult when people feel that their basic needs are threatened. If a conflict is only about positions, compromise is usually possible. If the conflict is tied to things like dignity, identity, survival, or belonging, it's more likely to become deep-rooted, and compromise can be harder. So, for example, a border dispute might appear to be about territory, but underneath all that, it might be national identity, historical trauma, security fears, fears about access to resources, symbolic meaning, or political legitimacy. An intrastate conflict might seem to be about control over the government, but it might really be about exclusion, fear of repression, unequal citizenship, group insecurity, or demands for recognition. So this type of model helps us see why conflicts are so layered. It helps us understand why, again, these single cause explanations don't really work. The visible demand may not show the full conflict. To understand conflict onset and escalation, we need to ask things like, of course, what are the visible positions? But what interests lie underneath that? And what needs are being threatened? And then also, how do institutions, incentives, and identities shape those demands? So that also sets us up a little bit for next week, where we're going to talk more about identity and group conflict, because so many conflicts become especially intense when group identity, belonging, dignity, and recognition are experienced as threatened. But that's also linked to needs. So let's turn to complexity theory. Complexity theory comes from systems theory, biology, ecology, and nonlinear systems research. It's been adapted into conflict analysis, peace building, and conflict transformation. The basic idea is that many conflicts are not simply complicated, they're complex. And this matters. So a complicated system might have many parts, but if we understand the parts well enough, we can predict how the system works. So think like a car engine, a machine might be complicated because it has so many parts, but if one part breaks, we can identify it and repair it. Complex systems are different. Complex systems have many interacting actors, feedback loops, adaptations, and unpredictable outcomes. They evolve, they react, they change over time. So think of things like ecosystems. And actions in one part of the system might produce unexpected effects or outcomes otherwise. So a lot of conflict systems are complex systems. They involve all types of layers of things: governments, opposition movements, armed groups, communities, institutions, media systems, economic pressures, historical narratives, actors, individuals, decisions, all these things. So there's no single actor who fully controls the system. And even well-intentioned interventions can actually cause unintended consequences. So, for example, a government might repress a protest to restore order, but repression can actually increase anger, strengthen those opposition networks, attract international attention, and escalate mobilization. An international actor might impose sanctions to pressure a regime, but the sanctions make the economic hardships worse for the civilians and strengthen that regime's propaganda or shift alliances. A peace agreement may end the direct fighting between armed leaders, but if it excludes local communities or unresolved grievances, the conflict might appear later in another form. So this is why complexity theory is useful. It helps us look at all these things: the escalation, the unpredictability, the feedback loops, unintended consequences, and nonlinear conflict dynamics. Nonlinear means that some small events can produce larger consequences, and it's complicated. A single protest, speech, assassination, crackdown, election, dispute Economic shock might not cause conflict by itself, but if the system's already unstable, the event can become a trigger. And this goes back to the idea of conflict onsets. Conflict onset is not usually caused by one single event. It happens when multiple pressures converge, when things like grievances, institutional weakness, economic instability, leadership decisions, opportunity structures, fear, uncertainty, and triggering events all overlap. So a little bit like systems thinking, complexity theory encourages us to be cautious and humble. It reminds us that conflict systems are difficult to predict and difficult to control. But again, there are limitations. So critics argue that complexity theory has become vague, difficult to operationalize, difficult to test, and sometimes too broad. If everything is connected to everything else, then analysis becomes overwhelming. So the challenge is to use complexity theory carefully. It shouldn't become an excuse to say, well, everything matters, so we can't explain anything. Instead, it helps us ask questions like, what actors are interacting? What feedback loops exist? What pressures are reinforcing one another? What unintended consequences might emerge? And where might intervention reduce escalation rather than intensify it? So again, it's this idea that things that acknowledge all these different factors and complexity are useful for conflict studies and conflict analysis. So to wrap up, today we looked at some more ways of understanding conflict, conflict onset, and multi-causal conflict. We looked at why monocausal explanations tend to fail. We looked at greed versus grievance. We looked at rational choice theory. We looked at strategic interaction, the security dilemma, the prisoner's dilemma, positions, interests, and needs, and complexity theory. The main takeaway is that conflict is multi-causal. It's relational, it's dynamic, and it's also context dependent. Different theories help us explain different dimensions of conflict. Greed versus grievance helps us think about the relationship between things like injustice and incentives. Rational choice theory helps us understand strategic behavior and decision-making under uncertainty. The security dilemma helps us explain how defensive actions can actually produce escalation. Positions, interests, and needs help us see that the visible demands often sit on top of deeper concerns. And complexity theory reminds us again that conflict systems are adaptive, they're unpredictable, and shaped by so many interacting pressures. So again, let's go back to the conflict or the concept reflection for this week. Why are conflicts rarely caused by a single factor? So for this week's reflection, I want you to resist the temptation to identify the cause of a conflict. I want you to think about things like these interacting pressures, the overlapping dynamics, the structural conditions, the institutions, the incentives, the identities, and the escalation processes. So how do multiple causes interact to shape conflict outcomes? And as you work on that, try and choose an example where you can think about or identify several interacting causes. You might think something is about political exclusion or economic inequality, institutional weakness, resource competition, identity tensions, leadership decisions, or triggering events. The goal isn't to list every single possible cause. It's to show and explain and analyze how different causes can interact. Next week, we're going to move more into identity and group conflict as part of our theme of drivers of conflict and conflict analysis. We're going to look specifically at social identity theory, in-groups and out-groups, things like nationalism, belonging, symbolic conflict, and even polarization. So in some ways, this week has focused more on the macro level systems, institutions, and strategic dynamics. Next week, we're going to be looking more closely at how people experience conflict through groups, identities, and belongings. As always, reach out to me if you have any questions or concerns. Make sure to get your assignments in on time. I know this week has been a bit weird because we had the holiday, But I hope everybody's caught up and doing okay, and I will see you next week.